Welcome back to There's a Place. I'm Jim. In this final instalment of Season 1, I'll be reflecting on our time at Whaddon House in the first 4 episodes. I'll put right a few inaccuracies, and I'll share some exciting new details which have emerged. There will be Soho sex club shenanigans, Beatles burglary, and car parking controversy, so it should be an exciting show. I'm not quite sure what kind of response I had expected the series to receive when I started out. I thought some people might be intrigued by some of the connections and obscure details, but I thought most people might find it dull. I was not prepared, therefore, for the reactions that came my way, which have been universally warm, supportive and encouraging. And I'd like to thank everyone who has contacted me or who has left a review on the various podcast platforms or on YouTube, where the series now also exists in audio-visual format, all of which have been very, very touching. If you have enjoyed the series, please consider giving a 5-star rating and review, as it helps other Beatles fans discover the project. Off the back of the series, I've also met some fabulous people, and some of them have shared with me new information which I'm very pleased to be able to present in this episode. With a little help from my friends, principally Mark Lewison, Pete Schroeders, Obadiah Jones and Steve Bradley, I've uncovered some fascinating information which ties up some of the loose ends most satisfyingly. Before we get going though, I know that some of you have been inspired to go and visit Whaddon House in Knightsbridge. If you went in June or July, you'll have been disappointed to have been met by a huge cage of scaffolding. Rendering work was taking place, which has now been completed. I'm not enamoured with the effect of the facelift, to be honest. The bare brick which covered the front facade between the balconies, and which looked a little bit like fruitcake, has been iced over with a thick layer of white render. Thus ends the appearance that was intact for 60 years. My grief is not too deep, it could have been worse. The balconies are untouched and the mosaic tiling is still there. They could have knocked the bugger down, as is the general trend with mid-century Beatles sites, so I'm not going to wail my lamentations into the night. It's just a bit of a shame. Whaddon House is definitely still worth visiting. One more thing before we get started. Just before I finished preparing this episode, Midas Man was released. I was wondering if I would need to rewrite sections in the light of the insights offered, but you will have seen that Whaddon House was airbrushed out of history completely. I'm quite pleased that I don't have to dismantle what I've already created, but I'm also rather disappointed in the factual inaccuracies in the film and the glaring omissions. Although I would be happy to discuss Midas Man in another forum, I've decided not to do so here. However, I do feel that this series is a useful companion piece to that project, and I hope that those who either enjoy or despise the movie will find interesting details in these 5 episodes. So, let's go back to William Muse. In episode 2 of There's a Place, I agonised over the dates that George and Ringo moved into and out of Flat 7. Well, my pal Obadiah Jones of the excellent podcast Gimme Some Truth was able to solve the move-in date definitively. I'd suggested sometime after the return from America in February 1964, but possibly into March. Obadiah drew from 2 sources which confirmed one another. Firstly, he told me about the memoir of actress Hayley Mills, Forever Young. In this, Mills quoted from her diary about the time she went on a date with George Harrison to a midnight charity film screening in the night between the 20th to the 21st of March 1964. At the end of the night, she wrote,
"When we finally got back to the Wick, Daddy was still awake, waiting for his daughter to be returned. He answered the door and suggested we have scrambled eggs, so we all trooped down to the kitchen and Dad cooked. I've never seen my father cook scrambled eggs before in my entire life. It was most surreal. Then George suddenly leapt to his feet, saying he was sorry to rush off. Ringo was packing up their home. They were moving house together at 4:30 that morning, with a police escort."
So here we have not just a date, but the exact time. It's also a very sweet story. For those who don't know, Hayley's father, John Mills, was an incredibly famous actor himself who appeared in more than 120 films in a career spanning 7 decades. Hayley is right. The scenario is surreal. Daddy John, the film star, making scrambled eggs for his daughter's rock star date in the middle of the night in Richmond-on-Thames before George rushes off to move house at 4:30 a.m. with a police escort. Hayley Mills, of course, has another Beatles connection in that she starred in The Family Way in 1967. The score for which was written by Paul McCartney and George Martin. John Mills also starred as her on-screen father-in-law. I watched the film recently and it's better than I'd been told it was. Definitely worth a view. Now, if you know Obadiah Jones, you'll know that he is thorough. As if this evidence wasn't enough, he pointed out Kenneth Womack's biography of Mal Evans, in which Womack writes,
On March 21st, hoping to avoid the regular encampment of fans who follow the bandmates' every move, Neil and Mal were forced to work in the pre-dawn hours to move George and Ringo into their new digs, a flat in Whaddon House in Knightsbridge.
And so there you have it. George and Ringo moved into Flat 7 of Whaddon House at 4:30 a.m. on the 21st of March. Thanks, Obadiah. In episode 2, I also tried to understand how Brian settled upon Whaddon House as his first London home, debating whether he bought or rented Flat 15. I think I've been too reliant on the few facts I had. Brian was staying at the Grosvenor House Hotel before he settled on Whaddon House. It was roughly the same part of town. I looked at newspaper clippings about the building project emerging in Knightsbridge, and I imagined Brian reading these in his suite at the hotel. What I hadn't really managed to do was to think like Brian might have thought. Although in the winter of 1963 he was more successful than he could ever have imagined possible, he was still Brian, a shy, insecure Jewish Liverpudlian. Staking a claim in the capital was a big deal. Scary. He wouldn't have gone about the process either like a member of the establishment or even like a brash nouveau riche cockney. Sticking a pin in a map was not his style. He was cautious, and his decisions were usually influenced by the advice of those with more experience than he had himself, and those from a similar milieu. So how did Brian find and settle on Whaddon House? Brian was keenly aware of anti-Semitic prejudice, and while proudly Jewish in many ways, I now feel that he would have been self-conscious of his background while choosing where to live. This was the most exclusive area in London. His neighbours, if we look on the electoral roll for Whaddon House, include such grand names as Terence and Elizabeth Farquhar Smith and the Earl and Countess of Iver. Brian did spend his formative years rubbing shoulders with toffs at various private schools. However, he always struggled to be accepted. He was convinced, for example, that his expulsion from Liverpool College derived from anti-Semitic prejudice. As an impressive young man in 1963, he might have been a grand success, but perhaps he felt that he was still, underneath it all, a Jewish furniture salesman from Liverpool. Selecting his home would certainly not have been as straightforward as looking at a newspaper article and saying, "Yep, I'll take that one," which I had originally assumed. It's perfectly logical that minority cultures find security in living in areas in which they don't have to be pioneers because someone from a similar background has already established themselves. If you continue to study the names on that electoral roll for Whaddon House, as Mark Lewison had before contacting me, you will also see another name. Brian's immediate neighbour in Flat 14 was one Norman Esau. Norman was 9 years older than Brian. While he was born in England, his father, Jack Esau, also known as Flash Esau, Flash Jack, and originally Joseph Aaron Isowicki, was born in 1899 in Russia and grew up in Poland. In 1947, his naturalization papers list his occupation as a caterer. However, this is something of a euphemism when you look into what he actually got up to. We're about to take a bit of a detour, so for now, just bank the important facts. Norman Esau was Brian's neighbour. Norman's father, Jack, was a Jewish immigrant businessman. It's almost certainly through the Esau connection that Brian ended up in Whaddon House. A little personal history. In 1998, I moved to London as a student at Goldsmiths. As much as I liked the pubs of New Cross and Deptford, I soon learnt that the real nightlife was to be found in town, and so when my student loan came through, most nights of the week I would take the train to Charing Cross Station and walk up through Soho to whichever club had an indie night on. My favourite was Thursday nights at the Wag Club on Wardour Street, because as well as a good dose of indie, you could also dance to a very decent 60s set. Little did I know back then that I was dancing in a venue of great historical significance, a place where the act of dancing had in fact been hugely important for the past 60 years. In 1935, black American singer Ike Yowza Hatch opened a jazz and swing club at 37 Wardour Street along with his business partner, one Joseph Aaron Isowicki, aka Flash Jack Esau. Taking its name from a lively tap dance from Harlem, the Shim Sham Club was an extremely important venue in Soho's fabulous history for many reasons, but in particular these three. It's thought to be the first London jazz club to welcome American performers. Its multiracial clientele enjoyed a relaxed atmosphere where black and white jazz lovers could socialise freely. It was also renowned for being openly queer-friendly, and as such became a vitally significant place in the history of LGBT culture. Jazz musicians who appeared at the club included George Happy Blake, Benny Carter, Nat Gonella, Fats Waller, and Garland Wilson. Of course, the Shim Sham Club also pissed off the powers that be and became a frequent target of the Rozzers. It's described in Metropolitan Police records as a den of vice and iniquity. This is from a blog which can be found on the National Archives website.
Music was key to the life of the club, which had a small elevated bandstand and a curved bar central to the space with ample room for dancing. Undercover police observations noted that the dancing was of an indecent manner, with P.C. Alwyn Stannard observing that
most of the couples appeared to derive sexual pleasure from the method of dancing.
Black British, Caribbean, and African American performers utilized this performance space, which was in itself risky in an era of restrictions on American music performers in the UK. Public letters were repeatedly sent to police, raising concerns around the morals of the club. A local resident wrote to the police commissioner, citing themselves as a neighbor of Wardour Street, complaining that
in the Shim Sham, women carry on perversion. Women with women. Men with men.
While the venue caused controversy through its associations with black music artists, progressive politics, and same-sex relationships, it was actually the club's liquor licensing that originally gained it notoriety with the police. Similar to many other clubs in 1930s London, the Shim Sham tried to avoid liquor licensing regulations by running as a so-called bottle party. Indeed, the Daily Express described it as the first bottle party in London. Such unlicensed clubs attempted to evade the law by claiming to run as a private party and offering alcohol on the basis that it was pre-ordered through wine merchants. On 5th July 1935, undercover police first raided the premises of the Shim Sham on the grounds of liquor license evasion, and the venue was charged with operating as an unlicensed club.
The Shim Sham was closed down, but its legacy was profound and heralded a golden age of the Soho underground. Jack Esau didn't stop at nightclubs. He was also a restaurateur, and he opened the renowned Esau's restaurant on Brewer Street, which attracted some of the most famous names of the 40s, 50s and 60s, including Danny Kaye, Walt Disney, Frank Sinatra, Rod Steiger, Judy Garland, Bette Davis, and Brian Epstein. Jack's son Norman was heavily involved in the restaurant and would, after his father's death in 1974, take over the business. And so was it perhaps in here, in the autumn of 1963, that Brian would have been having dinner and chatting to Norman Esau, who told him that he was moving into a swanky new flat in a recently built block on William Mews, Knightsbridge. I think it's highly likely. There are further connections between Esau's restaurant and the Beatles. The restaurant and the Jack of Clubs nightclub were to be found at 8 to 10 Brewer Street. In the same building, occupying the first floor, was the legendary Raymond Review Bar, a strip club owned by Soho legend Paul Raymond. In his autobiography, NEM's general manager and Brian Epstein's personal assistant, Alistair Taylor, admits to having been a regular at the Raymond Review Bar. When in the autumn of 1967 the Beatles were looking for a strip club to feature in Magical Mystery Tour, it made complete sense to approach Paul Raymond via Alistair Taylor, who was very happy for the group and the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band to use his club. On this same site there also appears to have been a cinema, Oscars. It was here that Ringo would return in December 1972 for the premiere of his directorial debut Born to Boogie, starring Mark Bolan and Elton John, who joined him for the premiere before the threesome, accompanied by Keith Moon, Donovan and Bernie Taupin, headed off to Tramp nightclub in the more respectable Jermyn Street. Other connections. In his twilight years, Jack Esau would marry actress Sherry Winton in 1969. Sherry, the mother of late TV star Dale Winton, died at the age of 40 in 1976 after an overdose of barbiturates, in a scenario not unlike the tragic end to the life of Brian Epstein, whose most celebrated star after the Beatles was Cilla Black, who would have a very close friendship with Dale Winton right up until her death. Paul Raymond, he of Raymond Review Bar, should be thanked for preserving much of seedy Soho. His adult entertainment empire would earn him a great deal of money, which he spent on property in his beloved Soho. The revolting attempts at gentrification in recent years as chain restaurants and coffee shops replaced the independent industries with which the area has been so long associated may not have been halted by Raymond's legacy, but he certainly made it harder for the developers to take over completely, as he owned so much of the real estate that they were hoping to redevelop. One such place is Esau's restaurant itself, which he acquired from Norman Esau and turned into drag club Madame Jojo's in 1986. Although Madame Jojo's closed in 2014, there are whisperings that it might rise like a phoenix from the flames. Let's hope so. And so back to our story. In 1963, Brian Epstein, looking for a posh new pad, hears of Whaddon House from Jack or Norman Esau. Here are successful Jewish businessmen at the centre of the London entertainment industry, who rub shoulders with American stars. Their advice is welcomed by Brian, who becomes Norman's new neighbour and proud tenant of Flat 15. Thank you to Mark Lewison for helping to prove Brian's motivations for selecting Whaddon House. But there was another neighbour too, who might also have been an influence on Brian. What followed has been told to me by Beatles expert and author of the blog Arrive Without Travelling, Steve Bradley. Steve is friends with a chap called Adam Kin, who is the son of Maurice Kin, who bought the New Musical Express, the NME, for just £1,000 in 1952 and then turned it into the UK's leading music paper. Its existence and Kin's navigation helped to propel the Beatles' career. Kin was another successful Jewish businessman and a close friend of Brian's. He also lived in a property on Lowndes Square, right next to William Mews, where Whaddon House sits, which he acquired in 1962. He would certainly have been aware of the new block of flats and might well have mentioned them to Brian. Again, it seems right that the recommendation of another successful Jewish businessman would have guided Brian in his house hunting. In episode 2, I debated whether Brian bought the flat or rented it. Having looked at the documents associated with the advertising of the property, I concluded that he must have rented. Steve discussed this with Adam Kin, who told him that the family property in Lowndes Square was also rented. Adam said that this was common for affluent Jewish families at the time. Thank you, Steve Bradley, for sharing your insights and research with me. And now a segue into other rental matters. What was life like for the Beatles as tenants? And what was work like for the letting agents who provided the roof over their heads? I'd thought that the let of Whaddon House would have been like any other let. Speak to the agent, sign your contract, pay your deposit from your own bank account, move in your gear. However, documents which Mark Lewison has shared with me indicate that Flat 7, where George and Ringo lived, was leased to the Beatles Limited. This means that letters concerning the tenancy were addressed to all 4 Beatles. So it was actually a Beatles gaff, not a private rent to George and Ringo. Which letters, you say? Some humdingers.
15th of October 1964. Messrs. Starkey, Harrison, McCartney and Lennon, Flat 7, Whaddon House, William Mews, London, SW3.
CNCP Management Limited made a mistake here. It's actually SW1, not SW3.
Dear Sirs, Basement Garage Space Number 9. Number 9? We gather that notwithstanding protests from our porter, there have been several occasions where one of your group, or your guests, have parked cars in the basement garage elsewhere than in your parking space at number 9. Number 9? Number 9? Number 9? This, of course, causes serious inconvenience to other occupiers of the garage, and we must call on you to cease this practice forthwith. Otherwise, we shall have no alternative but to take steps to forfeit the lease to you of space number 9. Number 9? For breach of covenants therein. We must ask you to appreciate that all spaces in the garage are let, and it is only fair and proper that each tenant occupies only his own space, and cooperation in this respect is obviously essential. Yours faithfully, C&CP Management Limited, P.W. Reid, Director.
Isn't this great? Several things to note. Firstly, flat 7 only had one parking space. Presumably each flat had only one. Would this be a problem for George and Ringo? Perhaps this was the reason why they used multiple spaces so they could each park their cars. Perhaps this is why there are pictures of George's E-Type out on the Mews, because he parked it here when Ringo was using space number 9. Well, no, actually. As we learned, George moved out of Whaddon House in July 1964, 3 months after this letter was written. Furthermore, Ringo didn't actually pass his driving test until the 8th of October 1964, precisely 1 week before C&CP management got in touch. However, he had been driving illegally in 1959 and then failed his first test in November 1960. So, either Ringo was parking his new Facile Vega in the wrong space, conceivable if he'd had no use of it until a week ago, or the other Beatles and their buddies had been cheekily parking their assortment of Rolls-Royces and Aston Martins wherever they fancied, which seems entirely plausible. There's a great picture of Ringo, taken by Leslie Bryce, who shot George in his E-Type 6 months earlier, in his new car, emerging from the underground garage of Whaddon House just after passing his test and looking as happy as Larry. Beep, 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 yeah! In the first 4 episodes, I gave little consideration to how the Beatles' neighbours would have felt about sharing the Mews with them. Here, as we can see, there were significant tensions, but it didn't stop at parking spaces. Back when George, Ringo and Brian were all in Whaddon House in July 1964, they were also persona non grata with the residents.
Monday, 13 July 1964. Brian Epstein Esquire, Flat 15, Whaddon House, William Mews, Lowndes Square, SW1. Dear Mr. Epstein, Re Whaddon House, SW1. We are sorry to have to write this letter to you, but we are wondering if it would be feasible for the Beatles to find another furnished flat. Whilst the company has no complaint against the Beatles and their use of the flat, their fans are becoming such a nuisance that we feel it would be better in the interests of all concerned if they were to find another flat. We are continually receiving complaints every day, and on Thursday last, a key to the building was stolen by one of the fans, and also they are continually damaging the outside and inside of the block. We should very much appreciate your help and understanding in this matter. Yours sincerely, Rita Weston.
I don't wanna see you go, but darling, you better go now.
I find it interesting that Mrs. Weston refers to Flat 7 being furnished. We know that Brian's was unfurnished. I wonder what the standard provision in the block was. As I've already mentioned, I've never seen a picture of George and Ringo's flat. I'd love to. There are some lovely pictures of the pair with Astrid Kircher in a flat around the same time, early 1964, but I'm almost completely certain that these were taken in Green Street, probably just a week or 2 before the move to Whaddon House. Anyway, Brian replied to Mrs. Weston with typically Epsteinian charm.
July 17, 1964. Mrs. Rita Weston, Marla and Marla, 25 Sloane Street, Knightsbridge, London, SW1. Dear Mrs. Weston, regarding your letter of the 13th instant, to which I regret such a delayed reply, I am naturally sorry to note the sentiments. However, we will consider this possibility and endeavour to look around for an apartment for the Beatles. Incidentally, is there anything that we could do in order to allay the complaints and anxieties of the neighbours? For instance, although it may not be a particularly effective preventative, one way might be to have a conspicuous notice at the end of the Mews, stating quite definitely that it is a private road and that trespassers will be most severely prosecuted. There must be some other way by which it is possible to prevent people actually entering the Mews. Yours sincerely, Brian Epstein.
What do you make of this? Would Brian actually uproot the Beatles after one complaint? He's very quick to put forward his willingness to concede. Does this mean that he recognised the severity of the tensions arising from the fans' sieges? Is it just a politely vague half-promise without any real substance? We will consider this possibility and endeavour to find an alternative. I sense that he is at least a little rattled, and probably because he loved his own flat so much he didn't want to risk being turfed out himself. Does this also change the way that we react to the party, which we looked at in episode 4, and which took place atop Whaddon House on the 12th of August 1964, just a month after this epistolary exchange? You could argue that such an event could be designed to impress the neighbours, and perhaps they were all invited to gorge on the caviar and to rub shoulders with Judy Garland. However, a loud, spectacular extravaganza which went on until 4 a.m. with blaring music and the most ostentatious alterations to the muse, you could also argue it was 2 fingers raised at all the curtain twitchers. I'd love to get inside Brian's mind. The fans were certainly a nuisance on William Muse, particularly following one event from George and Ringo's tenancy in Whaddon House, which I left out of the first 4 episodes. I don't really know why I left out the event. I think it was because all I really knew was that it happened, and so it felt like a bit of a side note. However, thanks to Obadiah Jones, I have more information now which raises the event's significance and which is definitely worth reflecting on now.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and God bless you. You've got a lucky face. The end. You know you make me want to shout.
On Sunday, 19th of April 1964, the Beatles had had a grueling day at the IBC recording studios on Portland Place, recording the soundtrack for the TV show Around the Beatles. They had arrived for work at the ungodly hour of 10 a.m. and stayed until 8:30 in the evening. They didn't even get to go home afterwards. They had a party to attend. At least George and Ringo didn't have far to walk home, for the party was at 43 Lowndes Square, seconds away from William Muse. Whose party was it? None other than Maurice Kinn, of whom we heard earlier, the proprietor of the NME. One of Brian's most powerful mates, this was a bloke worth sucking up to, even if they had little energy for hobnobbing. However, a grueling day was about to get worse. When George and Ringo returned home after the party, they discovered their flat in disarray. They had been burgled. They called the police. By Monday evening, the news had reached their hometown. Here is an article from the Liverpool Echo, Monday the 20th of April, 1964.
Burglar robs George and Ringo. Flat ransacked by early morning. Souvenirs of US trip vanish in £400 haul.
Beatles, George Harrison and Ringo Starr returned from a show at 1 a.m. to find their second-floor flat in Whaddon House, William Muse, Knightsbridge, London, ransacked at the weekend. A cat burglar, clambering over adjoining roofs, got onto the balcony of the flat and forced the French windows. He went from room to room, pulling out drawers and ransacking cupboards. George and Ringo called the police and began a check to see what had been taken. Among the missing items were some souvenirs of the Beatles' recent United States trip, a pair of cufflinks and some cash, a haul worth about £400 in all.
But the burglary robbed them of more than expensive trinkets. It would prove to cost them their privacy.
Worried by address leak.
George and Ringo were interviewed by detectives from Gerald Road Police Station. Their main concern was not about the loss of their property, but that their address should become known. Manager of the Beatles, Mr. Brian Epstein, is said to have a second-floor flat in Whaddon House, a new block of 18 spacious flats, each with a balcony. William Muse is a private road in a quiet residential area off Lowndes Square. Within a few hours of the news of the robbery, 4 Beatles fans from Highgate, North London, hurried to the flat to offer their sympathy to George and Ringo, but they were not there. One girl, 16-year-old Marissa Good, said,
"We came to commiserate with them. We do feel very strongly about this. We feel the Beatles are being persecuted."
She said the way some fans were behaving forced the Beatles to move around. She added,
"I expect they'll have to move away from here now."
Marisa was only half wrong. George, in his typical way, was affronted by the invasion of his privacy, and it seems almost certain that this event initiated his search for a new place with greater security. The news story from the 18th of July 1964 in the Mirror, which we looked at last time, which claimed he had bought Kinfauns 2 months prior, now sounds more plausible than I originally thought. The day following the burglary, on the 21st of April, the Daily Herald ran the same story, but with some funny and touching additions.
Fellow Beatle John Lennon said,
George and Ringo left the party and returned a few hours later to say there'd been a great train robbery at their flat. Don't think George minded the money going so much, but he was sore about having the address leak out so soon.
John added,
"The fans don't bother me so much. I live with my wife. And Paul McCartney is a really smart one. He moves around so fast on his own, they never catch up with him."
One disappointed girl yesterday was 12-year-old Sophie Turner, who lives opposite Whaddon House. She said,
I knew that the Beatles were there, but my mother and father told me to keep it quiet. I've had it all to myself.
Most of the residents of the block of flats have kept mum about their neighbours. But what neighbour said,
I heard people practising with guitars and drums, but I never thought it was the Beatles. They didn't sound particularly good.
Poor little 12-year-old Solveig Turner. Imagine having such a secret, the Beatles living over the road from you, and you can't share it with anyone. It could also have been that she needed a little magic in her life at the time. If my research is correct, her father, the renowned ballet dancer Harold Turner, had died 18 months previously of a heart attack at the age of 52. It's odd that she is reported as having been told by her mother and father to keep stum, but it could be a reporting or editing error. I can't think there would be many 12-year-old Solveig Turners living in London at the time, and so I presume this is the same girl. And so the burglary incident really does shine some light on why George moved out so quickly, and it gives us a greater understanding of the pressures of daily life for the Beatles, Brian Epstein, and all those who had the fortune or misfortune of sharing their private worlds. In episode 2, I gave you a tour of Brian's flat based on the couple of dozen images I had gathered. Since then, I've received new photos which are not available online, which have given me a much better understanding of some aspects of the layout. Have you heard of Pete Schroeders? He's the co-author of The Beatles London, along with Mark Lewison and Adam Smith. Mark introduced me to Pete, who very kindly sent me some photos, including some taken from inside Brian's bedroom, which I found particularly thrilling. I was pleased that they backed up some of the educated guesses I'd made about the flat's floor plan, and they confirmed that the master bedroom was indeed at the northern point of the flat, next to the living room, through the door to the left of Elvis's gun holster. The door to the bedroom is at its left corner, so when you walk in the room, it expands to your right. As you walk in, there is a mirror on the left-hand wall above a small dressing table. This mirror can be seen in the published photos from Brian's autobiography, A Cellar Full of Noise, but there's no indication in those photos of the room layout, which I now understand. Directly ahead in the back left corner is a built-in wardrobe. It's fairly small, would hold around 6 suits. In the opposite corner, the back right, there is an identical built-in wardrobe. Between the two wardrobes, against the back wall, is Brian's bed, with the headboard against the wall. The window is on the right-hand wall, on the back of the building, and beneath the window is a G-plan set of drawers, on top of which is an antique clock, and what look like 2 matching candlesticks. On the wall in which the door is set, there is also another door directly opposite the bed. This, I assume, is an ensuite bathroom. The pictures are wonderful, and they show Brian looking very happy, as he and Lonnie Trimble pack his bags for a trip to New York on the 7th of June, 1964. Speaking of Lonnie, in episode 3 we looked at Lonnie Trimble, Brian's houseman or cook, his history working for Ava Gardner and Peter O'Toole, his time at Whaddon House, the insights he gave us about Brian's relationships, and then his later life, which I'd pieced together on scant evidence. Whereas I've received lots of fantastic new insights into other elements of the first 4 episodes, I didn't receive any additional info on Lonnie, but I did hear from a lot of people who said that they were intrigued by his story, so I decided to do a little more research and see if any more light could be shed. I started by looking again at the Arena documentary, The Brian Epstein Story, and the interviews that Lonnie gives in his garden. You might remember that he stands in his garden wearing a bright red jumper, with the Thames behind him, Putney Bridge on the left, Fulham Railway Bridge on the right. I'd already pinpointed the street, Deodar Road in Putney, by using Google Maps, so I got in the car and headed there. My logic was that Lonnie, having given the interview in 1998 and having died in 2010, it was perfectly possible that there would be neighbours still there who would remember him. It was a beautiful sunny day, and after parking outside number 28 Deodar Road, I walked up and down the street. I went to Fulham Railway Bridge, which gives pedestrians access to the river. It's a beautiful piece of Victorian ironwork architecture, designed by Brunel's former assistant William Jacob and built by Head Wrightson, opened in 1889. I walked along the bridge and tried to look into the gardens on my left, hoping to identify Lonnie's, but the view was obscured. So I walked back and down the romantic stone staircase onto Deodar Road. Now, although I'm naturally reticent about approaching strangers and keenly aware of how Londoners in particular don't welcome such interactions, I figured I'd come this far, so I should really muster up the courage. I picked a likely house and was walking down the long front garden path when a middle-aged man emerged, heading towards his Mercedes with a suitcase. He looked at me affronted, and I garbled my reason for trespassing. He did not appear to be in the mood to assist. He said he'd been at the house since 2000, and so I felt certain that he knew something he wasn't telling me. In embarrassed desperation, I showed him a clip of Lonnie in his garden on my phone. I said, "Do you realise that your home might have a connection to the Beatles? Like, the actual Beatles?" "No, I don't know him," replied the man. "Don't have much to do with the neighbours, to be honest." That's fortunate for them, I thought, walking away, as the grumpy man loaded his suitcase into the Merc. I felt very foolish. It wasn't going to work, so I went back to the car, but just before getting in, looked back at the houses opposite, one of which I knew was Lonnie's. My eyes were drawn by one in particular, number 39, and I had a sudden feeling that this was the house. So I tiptoed to the door and pressed the bell. I waited. I pressed it again. No response. Oh well, I've tried. As I walked back along the gravel drive, I turned to my left and noticed that the garden of the house next door was filled with brightly painted garden gnomes. I hadn't seen garden gnomes for years and years. The person who lives there, I thought, is either a friendly, welcoming person, or they're bonkers, or maybe both. Either way, I felt that they would open their door and wouldn't make me feel like the weirdo I currently felt. What the hell, one more try. However, there was one more problem. The house had been converted into 2 flats. Which one belonged to the owner of the garden gnomes? I took a punt and went for flat 1. I was greeted by a gent called Martin, whose eyes, when I mentioned Lonnie, twinkled. Yes, he knew him. Lonnie was his next-door neighbour at number 39, the house I'd just tried. We chatted on the doorstep for 10 minutes, and I asked Martin if he would let me interview him. He said he'd think about it. A week later, Martin had agreed to do an interview, and so I took a microphone back to Deodar Road. What I learned didn't expand my Beatles or Brian Epstein knowledge, but it did give me a much better insight into Lonnie's last years and what he was like as a character.
When I moved in 98, Lonnie wasn't living next door. He was living at number 28.
Hang on a sec. I had parked my car outside number 28 on the other side of the road. How bizarre. The houses on that side of the road are considerably smaller terraces. Martin explained, alluding to how Lonnie used to help his wife Brenda in the garden.
He used to cut the hedge for her and do some of the back garden.
So he had lived next door, but he moved over there.
Yes, yeah. I think he moved just before I moved here, from what Brenda can remember. I just think the garden got too much for him. They wanted a smaller place where they hadn't got to worry about mowing the lawn and doing a lot of weeding.
I asked Martin when he had first met Lonnie.
Probably within days of moving in here, because you always knew when he was out there, he was loud. He used to come out and have a walk. And because Brenda knew them really well, she introduced me to Lonnie and Peter. Possibly 2006, 2007 maybe. Lonnie had a stroke. He was down at Charing Cross Hospital because Peter couldn't drive, didn't have any transport. We had a car, so we drove Peter down to see him in hospital. But there was complications because he was HIV.
This was a shock to me. I felt that I knew Lonnie quite well. Such a big revelation took me by surprise.
As much as he loved Peter, I said to you, he had a dalliance down at Clapham Common. Apparently he used to go down there a lot. So that's how he was. And he got with the wrong person and he managed to catch AIDS. Lonnie had a stroke, so he was rushed into hospital. There was complications because of his HIV. It was quite a severe stroke as well. He couldn't walk far. His speech was affected first of all, but then he got a bit better.
But as well as his own health problems, Lonnie would suffer another tragedy.
But I think it was while he was in hospital, Peter just died. I'm pretty sure it could have stroke or heart attack, but I know it was, and everyone was shocked because suddenly Peter's there, then he's suddenly not there. He was a proper English gent, Peter, lovely chap, really nice. I know Peter's family hated Lonnie, they really did. They obviously didn't like the fact that Peter was gay, and the fact that his partner was a big brash black man.
Martin and Brenda attended Peter's funeral.
And there's a lot of people there I didn't know.
Did you meet anyone from the background of Peter's family or anything?
No, they didn't go because of Lonnie. Because Peter left everything to Lonnie anyway. And so they hated that. They tried to contest it, but he'd written a will. Yeah. They did. Between them, they had quite a bit of money. And then when Lonnie came home, And it was over there. There was myself, my wife Brenda, my daughter was living here, and her son. And we used to more or less take it in turns looking after him. Although at the time as well, me and Brenda were still working. Well, Brenda was, that's the main thing. She did the majority of the work because he had no one else. He didn't want anyone else to come there. She'd go before we went to work, make him some breakfast. Then when we came home from work, we'd go over and cook him a meal, maybe sit a couple of hours with him chatting. Then before we went to bed, one of us would have to go back over there and then get him up into bed. But because it took such a toll on Brenda, she said to him, I'm not going to get the social services. I don't want them. I don't want any. I'm happy with you doing it. She said, I can't keep doing it, Lonnie. And it's wearing me out. So she did. She got the social in and he never spoke to her after that.
It's sad to think that Lonnie became estranged from Martin and Brenda in his final years.
He was fine afterwards because they really looked after him. They'd take him out, walk him up the road, then walk him back down slowly with his wheelchair. And if we were out there, he'd sort of look over and he'd just look away. And I thought, it hurt a bit because you think, all we've done for you, and this is how you're treating us. Well, we didn't go to the funeral, which was sad as well. We knew then, and we think back about it, you think, just be typical. I used to be out there doing the garden and I'd see him and I think, why don't I just go over and speak to him? And I thought, no, I'm not. No, if he wants to be pig-headed, I'll be pig-headed.
I had hoped to discover some new information about Brian or the Beatles, but it seems that Lonnie was quite private when discussing his past. So, did he ever talk much about his past or about his job working for Brian Epstein or anyone else?
Only that he'd work for them. He'd mention things, but he was still quite private in himself. Because he did have photos up. What happened to those, I've no idea. From where he was working with the Beatles, like working for Epstein and the Beatles were in it. He'd be cooking. I think there was one when he was with Epstein. I don't know if Epstein was in it, in the picture, but a couple of the Beatles were there as well.
After our interview, Martin wrote to me with some clarifications. Lonnie's stroke was earlier than he had thought, and Peter Stone's death both happened in 2004. Lonnie and Peter had also been witnesses at Martin and Brenda's wedding, and I was thrilled to see pictures of him at the ceremony, pictures which you can see on my Instagram account, Brutal Beatles. I'm very grateful to Martin for taking the time to share his memories of Lonnie, and to Martin's wife, Brenda. I believe that there might be more to the story which I haven't been able to uncover. What happened to Lonnie's possessions after he died? The pictures, the memoirs he may or may not have started before his stroke? Martin did give another lead, Lonnie's other next-door neighbour, Elizabeth Crowther Hunt, also known as Elizabeth Coulson. She helped look after Lonnie during his illness and may have more information to add. Unfortunately, she moved away from Putney some time ago, and I haven't been able to trace her so far. Digging more into Lonnie's life has uncovered some aspects to his personality which reveal a far more complex individual than the one I presented in episode 3. I was sad to learn that he had been unfaithful to Peter, and that he hadn't always been an easy person to know. I did hear from Mark Lewison that Brian's personal assistant, Joanne Newfield, found Lonnie unpleasant when she worked with him at Chapel Street. However, she only began working for Brian in Chapel Street at the very end of Lonnie's employment in December 1965, when tensions between him and Brian were already strong, and Lonnie felt himself to be the victim of Brian's capriciousness, so she entered an already toxic working atmosphere. Despite all this, I remain fascinated by Lonnie Trimble, and I believe that he is an important character in the story.
I suppose you could describe Lonnie as Marmite, really. You either loved him or you hated him. I mean, you couldn't, if you knew him, you couldn't help but love him because he was so loud and in your face. You know what I mean? In a good way.
I'm nearly done, but before I go, I need to correct another couple of mistakes I made in the first 4 episodes. Firstly, I asserted that Klaus Voormann had lived in Montague Square, in the flat that Ringo took on after leaving Whaddon House, and where John and Yoko would live in 1968. This was a mistake. Klaus did spend some time living at 57 Green Street with George and Ringo, but not Montague Square. Secondly, and relatedly, I offered a very speculative version of events from the morning that the Beatles collected their MBEs, including the suggestion that Paul took the bus from Wimpole Street to Whaddon House. Mark Lewison showed me some pictures from that morning of Paul standing on the steps of Ringo's flat in Montague Square, along with some information about the 2 chauffeurs Les Anthony and Alf Bicknell. According to Mark, Paul either got himself to Montague Square where Alf Bicknell collected him and Ringo, or Alf collected Paul, most likely they lived around the corner from Wimpole Street, and together they went to collect Ringo. They all drove to William Mews, where Alf, through gritted teeth, had to accept John's insistence that Les Anthony drive them to the palace. Enormous thanks to Mark Lewison for this and for the many other insights he gave me, which have been included in this episode. And thanks to everyone else. Obadiah Jones, who solved George and Ringo's move-in date and who gave me details of the burglary. Please check out his pod, Give Me Some Truth. It's an incredibly well-researched series and is utterly fascinating. Steve Bradley, who gave me the details of Morris Kinn. Visit Steve's blog, Arrive Without Travelling. Pete Schroeders, who shared pictures of Brian's bedroom with me. I've already told you how important a book The Beatles London is, but Pete also edits the fabulous magazine Ferrari, which contains wonderful Beatles articles along with his distinctive graphic design style. I'd also like to thank Gareth Mayer from They Came to a Land Down Under, which is an excellent podcast, and the gang at Toppermost of the Poppermost pod for inviting me onto their show to give an interview about Brian, Nems and my own projects. Once again, huge thanks to Paul Abbott from The Big Sort, who gave this series its theme tune, and also to Tim Coker, who provided the artwork. The cast for this episode was as follows. Hayley Mills was played by Naomi Axon. Ken Womack was played by Zachary Stockhill. The National Archives blog was read by Tim Coker. CNCP Management Letter was read by Alan Dace. Rita Weston was played by Eleanor Gray. Brian Epstein was played by Rupert Moss. The Liverpool Echo journalists were Kathleen and Liam Fitzpatrick. The Daily Herald journalist was Piers William. John Lennon was played by Andy Tickle. Solveig Turner was played by Sophia Axon. The William Muse neighbour was played by Lindsay Watson. And Marisa Good was played by Liberty Axon. Enormous thanks to all. Please tell your friends about the pod and leave a review. Don't forget to have a look at the YouTube versions of the first 4 episodes, as I think the visuals add another layer of interest, and I hope that you will agree. And that's it. I'll see you again after a short break for Season 2.